In 1577, Swiss workers digging near a monastery pulled something massive from the earth, bones, but not from any animal they recognized. The skeleton was enormous. The femur alone measured over 5 feet long. City officials called in physicians. They examined the remains and reached a conclusion. These were the bones of a giant human. The discovery didn't surprise anyone because across the ancient world, completely separate cultures had already said the same thing, that giants once lived among ordinary people. The Greeks recorded the Titans. The Norse spoke of the Jotnar. Ancient Hebrew text described the Nephilim, beings of enormous size who walked the earth before the flood. These weren't presented as myths, they were presented as memories. But here's what makes this strange. The cultures that told these stories never contacted each other. They didn't share borders. They didn't share a language. And yet the details aligned. Beings far larger than normal humans, living alongside people, then disappearing. But why would the same story appear in places that had no connection? What did ancient people keep finding that made this belief feel so real? And is there any scientific evidence that confirms these claims? Get comfortable. We're going back to see what made this belief feel so real. If you enjoy these quiet explorations of ancient mysteries, tap like and subscribe. And if you feel comfortable sharing, let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what the time is there. It's always a joy to see how far across the globe these science stories travel. Let's continue. The word itself seems simple at first, yet it carries different meanings depending on where it is placed. In stories, a giant can stride across mountains and stand far beyond the limits of ordinary life. In science, the same word must be held more carefully, measured, examined, and separated into parts that can be tested against the physical world. To move forward, the idea must be divided, not dismissed, not accepted outright, but gently unfolded into categories that can be observed. What appears as one mystery from a distance begins to separate into several distinct possibilities when brought closer. Some individuals are simply tall within the normal range of human variation. Across different times and places, height has never been fixed. Nutrition, health, and environment shape the body in quiet ways, allowing certain people to grow far above the average of their community. When such a person stands among others of smaller stature, the difference can feel striking, even memorable enough to linger in collective memory. There are also conditions within the human body that alter growth itself. The delicate balance of hormones, especially those governed by the pituitary gland, can shift in ways that extend height far beyond what is typical. These cases are rare, often accompanied by strain within the body, and they leave behind clear biological signatures. Bones lengthen, joints bear unusual stress, and proportions follow patterns that medicine has come to recognize. Beyond these, the human story includes other branches that once lived alongside our own. Different human species, shaped by separate paths through time, carried bodies that could appear broader, denser, or more physically imposing. Their presence in the ancient world suggests that encounters between distinct human forms were once part of everyday reality. The memory of such encounters may have carried forward, softened, and reshaped over generations. Then there are bones that do not belong to humans at all. The earth preserves the remains of creatures far larger than anything alive today. When these fragments surface weathered and incomplete, they can resemble familiar shapes in unfamiliar scale. Without a framework to interpret them, it becomes easy to see something human where none exists. A single misidentified bone can begin a story that feels grounded in physical truth. These 4 paths form the foundation. Each offers a different way in which the idea of giants might arise, not as a single explanation, but as a convergence of separate realities. By placing them side by side, the word giant begins to lose its simplicity and gain structure. From here, the approach must remain steady. Evidence is drawn from what can be measured and preserved. Anatomy reveals how bodies grow and where they fail. Archaeology records where remains are found and how they are arranged within the earth. Genetics traces patterns carried quietly through generations. Fossils extend the timeline far beyond memory, offering fragments of worlds that no longer exist. Recorded measurements anchor claims and numbers that can be checked and compared. Within this framework, the question shifts almost without notice. The existence of stories is not in doubt, as they have been carried across time with remarkable persistence. What matters now is whether those stories align with physical traces left behind, whether any of these categories point not to isolated cases or misunderstandings, but to a consistent population of humans whose size exceeds what biology allows. The structure does not remove the sense of wonder, it gives it shape, allowing each possibility to be explored without losing clarity. In this quiet sorting, the boundary between imagination and evidence becomes visible, not as a wall, but as a space where both can be examined with care. After the ground shifts, it does not return to silence immediately. Soil loosens, layers slip, and what has rested for ages begins to show itself along the edges of the world. In these moments, the surface of the earth becomes thin, and something from a far older time presses quietly into view. A curve appears first, pale against darker soil, too smooth to be stone, and too large to be easily understood. As more earth is brushed away, the shape continues, extending far beyond what a familiar body would suggest. A single bone can emerge longer than an arm, thicker than a wrist, carrying a weight of presence that feels difficult to place within ordinary experience. For most of human history, there was no language to separate the living from the long extinct. Creatures that no longer walked the land left behind no stories of their own, only fragments buried in silence. When those fragments surfaced, they entered a world that knew only what it could see around it. The idea that an entirely different kind of animal once existed lay outside the boundaries of common thought. In that absence, interpretation followed the closest shape available. The structure of a limb, the suggestion of joints, the familiar rhythm of bone segments, all pointed towards something human in form, though vastly enlarged. What stood before the eye was not recognized as alien, but as a version of the known, stretched beyond its usual limits. These discoveries did not arrive as isolated curiosities. They appeared in fields after heavy rains, along riverbanks where water had carved into the land, on slopes where the ground had given way. Each appearance carried the same quiet force, an object that could be touched, lifted, examined, held in the hands as something undeniably real. A story told in words can drift, but a story anchored in a physical object gains a different kind of permanence. The weight of bone, the texture of its surface, the scale that resists easy comparison, all contribute to a sense that the past has left behind direct evidence. It is no longer only memory or imagination, but something that occupies space and demands explanation. Within communities, such findings would not remain private. They would be shown, discussed, interpreted through the shared understanding of the people who encountered them. Without a framework to place these remains among vanished species, the conclusion often settled into a familiar form. These were not the bones of unknown beasts, but of beings who once walked the same ground, larger and more powerful than those who found them. The presence of such remains offered a bridge between belief and observation. Traditions that spoke of immense figures were no longer distant or abstract. They could be connected to something visible, something that seemed to confirm what had been passed down through generations. The boundary between narrative and physical reality began to soften, not through speculation, but through contact with the material world. Over time, each discovery added another layer to this quiet accumulation. A bone here, a fragment there, each one reinforcing the sense that the land itself held traces of a different scale of life. The idea of giants did not rely solely on imagination, it rested in part on encounters that felt immediate and undeniable. In this way, the ground became a keeper of impressions that outlasted their original context. What had once belonged to creatures of distant eras entered human understanding as something closer, reshaped by the limits of knowledge available at the time. The mystery deepened, not because the evidence was absent, but because it was present in a form that invited a very specific kind of interpretation. In certain places, the past does not remain separate from the present. It rises quietly into daily life, carried not as an abstract idea, but as something that can be seen, handled, and given a place within familiar understanding. When such a presence appears, it does not arrive empty. It enters a world already filled with memory, tradition, and the quiet shaping force of inherited stories. A fragment uncovered from the earth does not speak on its own. It is received, interpreted, and woven into meaning by those who encounter it. Without a structured way to distinguish one kind of ancient life from another, the object becomes part of what is already known. A large bone does not remain an isolated curiosity. It is absorbed into a narrative that gives it identity and purpose. In some communities, such discoveries were not seen as belonging to unknown creatures or distant ages. Instead, they were linked to figures already present in local tradition. Ancestors described as powerful, heroes remembered for their strength, beings spoken of in quiet tones across generations, all offered a place where these remains could belong. The physical form seemed to confirm what memory had preserved. This merging of object and story creates a moment where two different kinds of truth meet. One comes from the material world, shaped by time and preserved in the ground. The other comes from human experience, carried through voice, ritual, and shared belief. When they align, even loosely, the connection can feel complete, as though something once uncertain has been given form. The effect of this alignment reaches beyond a single discovery. Once a bone is understood within a story, it changes the story itself. What may have once been symbolic or distant becomes anchored to something that can be pointed to, visited, or remembered in a specific place. The narrative gains weight, not through repetition, but through association with something that appears tangible. Over time, this connection strengthens. Each retelling carries not only the original idea, but also the presence of the object that seemed to support it. The story no longer exists only in language. It is tied to a location, a finding, a moment when the past seemed to reveal itself directly. This gives the narrative a stability that is difficult to unsettle. Even when new interpretations become possible, the earlier connection does not easily fade. The human mind holds on to links that feel grounded in experience. A story that has been reinforced by something seen and touched resists replacement, not through resistance alone, but through the quiet persistence of memory. Across different regions, similar patterns emerge. Objects, without clear explanation, are drawn into existing frameworks of meaning. The unfamiliar becomes familiar by being placed within a known structure. In this way, physical remnants do not simply inspire stories, they settle into them, becoming part of a larger continuity that blends observation with tradition. What begins as a moment of discovery becomes something more enduring. The object remains, and with it, the interpretation that first gave it meaning. Over generations, the distinction between the two can soften until the story and the evidence seem inseparable. Within this quiet process, belief does not arise from imagination alone. It grows from the meeting point between what is found and what is already remembered. The result is not a deliberate construction, but a natural merging of perception and inheritance, where the past is understood through the shapes that are closest at hand. Long before names were given to vanished species, the ground carried traces of bodies built on a scale rarely seen in the present world. These remains did not appear all at once. They surfaced in scattered places, shaped by time, and revealed in fragments, each one carrying a sense of size that felt difficult to reconcile with familiar life. Among these remnants were the bones of mammoths and mastodons, creatures that once moved across vast landscapes during colder ages. Their forms are now understood through careful study, yet for most of human history, they were encountered without context. A single limb bone from such an animal could stretch far beyond the length of any human arm or leg, its thickness suggesting strength far greater than anything observed in living memory. When such a bone was uncovered, its structure did not immediately suggest an unfamiliar species. The arrangement of joints, the smooth curves, and the hollow interior characteristic of large mammals could resemble patterns already known from the human body. Without a framework to distinguish between species long gone and those still living, the simplest interpretation often followed the closest resemblance. The scale of these remains played a quiet but powerful role. Size alone carries meaning. It suggests presence, weight, and a kind of importance that draws attention. When an object exceeds expected proportions, it invites explanation, not through abstraction, but through comparison with what is already understood. A bone of unusual length and mass could be seen not as belonging to an unknown animal, but as belonging to a known form, enlarged beyond ordinary limits. Across regions where these fossils were more common, similar interpretations could arise independently. In parts of Europe, Asia, and the Americas, landscapes shaped by ancient ice preserved the remains of these large creatures beneath layers of sediment. Over time, natural processes exposed them in fields, along river edges, and in places where the earth had shifted just enough to reveal what lay beneath. In such environments, encounters with large bones were not rare events. They formed a pattern, a repeated experience that quietly influenced how the past was imagined. When similar shapes appeared again and again, always larger than expected, they reinforced the idea that something once existed at a different scale of life. The land itself became a kind of teacher, offering fragments that suggested continuity between the known and the unknown. Each discovery added to an accumulating sense that the world had once been inhabited by beings larger than those seen in the present. This understanding did not require formal study. It grew through repeated contact, through the steady presence of physical remains that seemed to point in the same direction. Over generations, these impressions settled into local traditions. Stories shaped by memory and experience found support in the objects that emerged from the ground. The connection did not depend on precise identification. It rested on resemblance and scale, on the quiet alignment between what was found and what was believed. In this way, the remains of mammoths and mastodons became part of a larger pattern of interpretation. They did not simply exist as isolated curiosities. They contributed to a broader understanding of the past, one in which size carried meaning and physical evidence appeared to confirm inherited ideas. The presence of these fossils across wide regions helps explain why certain themes appear again and again in distant places. Similar conditions produced similar encounters, and similar encounters shaped similar beliefs. Without shared language or direct contact, different communities could arrive at comparable conclusions, guided by the same kind of evidence rising slowly from the ground beneath them. Before any story is spoken, recognition begins quietly within the mind. The human brain does not wait for complete information. It moves quickly, searching for patterns that resemble what it already knows, shaping fragments into something familiar even when the details are incomplete. This tendency is most visible in the way faces and bodies are perceived. Even the smallest arrangement of curves and shadows can suggest eyes, a nose, or the outline of a head. This process unfolds automatically, guided by neural pathways that favor recognition over uncertainty. It allows meaning to emerge from partial forms, creating coherence where there might otherwise be confusion. When a skull appears in the earth, especially one worn by time, it rarely arrives intact. Surfaces erode, edges soften, and entire sections may be missing. Cavities open where material has been lost, and contours shift in ways that obscure their original structure. In this altered state, the skull becomes something open to interpretation, its true form hidden behind layers of absence. A large fossil skull, encountered without context, can suggest proportions that feel close to human while extending beyond expected limits. The placement of openings, the curve of a dome, or the alignment of fragments may echo the general arrangement of a human head. Even when the details do not match perfectly, the overall impression can settle into something recognizable. The mind responds by completing what is not fully present. Missing sections are imagined into place, gaps are filled with assumed structure, and irregular features are smoothed into familiar patterns. This act is not deliberate. It arises from the same process that allows people to recognize a face in dim light or a figure at a distance. The brain prefers a known shape over an undefined one. In such moments, scale adds another layer to the interpretation. When the perceived form already resembles a human structure, an increase in size does not break the pattern, it extends it. The object is not seen as something entirely different, but as something similar, expanded beyond ordinary experience. The result feels less like discovery and more like confirmation. This quiet transformation from fragment to figure can happen quickly, sometimes within a single glance. What remains afterward is not the uncertainty of the original object, but the clarity of the interpreted form. Once this image settles into memory, it becomes difficult to separate the initial perception from the underlying material. Over time, these impressions can take on a life beyond the moment of discovery. A shape recognized as human, though only partially so, may be described and shared in ways that preserve the interpretation rather than the ambiguity. Each retelling carries the completed image forward, strengthening its presence within collective understanding. The process does not rely on error alone. It reflects a natural function of perception, one that allows humans to navigate a complex world by finding meaning in incomplete information. In most cases, this ability is useful, guiding recognition and decision with remarkable efficiency. In others, it creates forms that exist more in the mind than in the object itself. Within this gentle blending of observation and imagination, a single skull can become more than a fragment of bone. It can suggest a presence, a scale, and a story that feels grounded in what was seen. The boundary between what is there and what is perceived grows soft, allowing interpretation to settle into something that carries the weight of reality. Ink on paper once carried discoveries across great distances, turning local events into shared knowledge almost overnight. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, newspapers became the stage where unusual findings could take on a life far larger than their origin. Reports of enormous skeletons appeared in columns and headlines, described with a confidence that gave them the weight of established fact. These accounts often followed a familiar rhythm. A group of workers, farmers, or travelers would uncover bones during ordinary activity. The remains were said to be far larger than expected, sometimes arranged in ways that suggested burial rather than accident. Measurements were offered, often impressive in scale, and brief statements from observers were included to reinforce the sense that something remarkable had been found. Once printed, the story did not remain in one place. It was copied, summarized, and republished by other papers, each version carrying slight variations in detail. As the account traveled, the tone could shift, becoming more certain, more dramatic, or more expansive. What began as a local report could spread across regions, repeated so often that it seemed to gain confirmation simply through its presence in multiple sources. Within these descriptions, the line between observation and embellishment was not always clear. Some reports provided only minimal information, leaving much to interpretation. Others included precise figures that were difficult to verify. In certain cases, the language suggested a level of certainty that did not match the available evidence, creating an impression of discovery without the foundation required to support it. The appeal of such stories rested partly in their immediacy. They were presented as recent events, not distant legends. The reader was invited to consider that something extraordinary had just been uncovered, something that might reshape understanding of the past. This sense of proximity gave the accounts a particular strength, as they felt connected to the present rather than confined to memory. At the same time, the pace of publication allowed little space for careful verification. A story that captured attention was valuable, and speed often mattered more than confirmation. Details could be reported before they were fully examined, and once in print, they became part of the public record, regardless of their accuracy. As these reports accumulated, they created a pattern that seemed difficult to ignore. Multiple accounts of large skeletons, appearing across different places and times, suggested a consistency that felt persuasive. The repetition itself became a kind of reinforcement, giving the impression that these findings were not isolated incidents but part of a broader reality. Yet beneath this surface, there was often a quiet absence. Follow-up reports were rare. The bones described in detail would disappear from the narrative, with little information about where they were stored, who examined them further, or what conclusions were eventually reached. The initial discovery remained vivid, while its resolution faded from view. This imbalance between appearance and confirmation allowed the stories to persist in a particular state. They remained present enough to influence belief, yet incomplete enough to avoid definitive evaluation. Each account added to a growing sense that something had been found, even if the evidence itself remained out of reach. In this way, the printed word became a powerful amplifier, shaping perception through repetition and suggestion. The idea of giant skeletons did not rely solely on ancient memory. It was carried forward through modern channels, given new life in the language of reporting, and sustained by the quiet gaps that followed each dramatic claim. The tone of discovery began to change when observations slowed and records became more careful. What had once been accepted through description alone now required preservation, measurement, and a clear chain from finding to verification. The shift was quiet, but it altered how claims were received, placing each report under a steadier, more deliberate light. When earlier accounts were revisited, many of them seemed to lose their clarity. Descriptions that once appeared precise began to feel incomplete when compared against the standards now expected. A reported skeleton might have been described in detail, yet no specimen remained available for study. Without the physical object, the claim rested only on words that could not be tested further. In some cases, the bones themselves had vanished from the record. They were said to have been stored, transported, or displayed, yet no trace could be located later. Institutions that might have held them contained no matching specimens, and private collections offered no clear documentation of their origin. The absence did not always suggest intention, but it left the original report without support. Where remains were said to exist, their measurements often shifted between accounts. A length recorded in one version might differ in another, sometimes by a noticeable margin. These inconsistencies created uncertainty, not through contradiction alone, but through the quiet realization that the details could not be fixed in a stable form. Images, when they were included, introduced another layer of difficulty. Early photography lacked the precision and controls that later methods would provide. Perspective could distort scale, and without reference objects, size became difficult to judge. Some images appeared altered or staged, though the extent of such changes was not always clear. The visual record, rather than confirming the claim, often deepened its ambiguity. The context of discovery also proved fragile. Many reports lacked detailed excavation notes, leaving unclear how the remains had been found or arranged within the ground. Without this information, it became difficult to determine whether the bones belonged together, whether they had been moved, or whether they had been interpreted correctly at the time of discovery. As these elements were examined together, a pattern began to emerge. The claims themselves were numerous, appearing across different places and periods, yet the supporting evidence rarely held the same consistency. Each account seemed complete at first glance, but under closer attention, the structure that supported it grew uncertain. This pattern did not eliminate the stories, it changed how they were understood. The presence of repeated claims suggested that something had been observed or believed often enough to leave a trace in written records. At the same time, the instability of the evidence suggested that the process of recording and interpreting these observations had not always been reliable. Scientific methods did not reject these accounts outright. Instead, they applied a framework that required each part of a claim to remain accessible and consistent. A bone must be available for examination, its measurements repeatable, its context clearly described. Without these elements, the claim could not be carried forward into established knowledge. Through this process, many of the earlier reports settled into a quieter state. They remained part of the historical record, but without the confirmation that would allow them to stand as verified findings. The contrast between the abundance of claims and the scarcity of reliable evidence became its own kind of observation, one that spoke not of absence, but of the complexity involved in turning discovery into certainty. In this careful sorting, the focus shifted from what was said to what could be shown. The difference between the two did not diminish the sense of curiosity that surrounded these accounts. It simply placed that curiosity within a structure that could hold it more steadily, allowing each claim to be considered with the same measured attention. Measured height brings the story into a different kind of light, one where the body can be understood through numbers that remain steady across time. In carefully recorded cases, human stature has reached levels that seem to press against the upper edges of what the body can sustain, not as legend, but as documented reality preserved in medical notes and photographs. In the early part of the 20th century, A young man named Robert Wadlow grew to a height of 8 feet 11 inches. His measurements were taken repeatedly, observed by physicians, and recorded with precision. Standing beside others, his presence was striking, not as an idea carried through story, but as a physical fact that could be witnessed directly. His height did not emerge from an unknown lineage, but from a specific condition affecting growth within the body. Another case, from a different time and place, tells a similar story through its own details. Sultan Kozan reached over 8 feet in height, his stature confirmed through consistent measurement. His growth followed patterns that medicine has come to recognize, shaped by the activity of the pituitary gland, which regulates the release of hormones responsible for development. When this regulation shifts, the body continues to grow beyond its usual limits. These individuals stand as clear examples of how human height can extend far beyond the average range without requiring an entirely separate population. Their existence is supported by records that can be revisited, by data that can be checked, and by physical evidence that remains accessible. The extraordinary nature of their size does not diminish under examination. It becomes more defined, placed within a framework that explains how such growth occurs. The body, in these cases, follows its own internal signals, responding to chemical messages that guide the lengthening of bones. Growth plates, which normally close after a certain stage of development, remain active for longer than usual. As a result, limbs extend, proportions shift, and height increases in a way that is both remarkable and biologically traceable. Yet within this extension, the body also reveals its limits. Great height places strain on joints, challenges circulation, and alters the balance between strength and support. The same processes that allow for unusual growth also introduce complexities that shape how these individuals move through the world. Their size carries both presence and constraint, each part of the same biological reality. These documented cases bring a quiet shift in understanding. The idea of immense human stature no longer belongs only to distant memory or uncertain reports. It exists within recorded history, grounded in observation and explained through the language of biology. The boundary between what seems possible and what is known begins to adjust, not through imagination, but through evidence that remains consistent. Within this clarity, the concept of giants takes on a different form. It becomes less about a lost population and more about the range contained within a single species. Human bodies, guided by their internal systems, can reach heights that feel extraordinary when viewed against the familiar. This does not dissolve the sense of wonder. It places it within a structure that can be understood, allowing the remarkable to remain, while giving it a clear and measurable shape. Within the body, growth is guided by signals that move quietly through the bloodstream, shaping bones, muscles, and organs with careful timing. Among these signals, growth hormone plays a central role, released from the pituitary gland deep within the brain. In most lives, this process follows a steady rhythm, rising during childhood, slowing as maturity approaches, and eventually settling into balance. In certain rare conditions, that rhythm does not slow when it should. The pituitary gland continues to release growth hormone beyond its usual limits, often influenced by a small, benign tumor that alters its regulation. This prolonged signal keeps the growth plates of bones active, allowing them to extend further than the body was designed to sustain. As height increases, the change is not isolated to length alone. Bones grow longer, yet they do not always gain the proportional strength needed to support the added mass. The joints, shaped for a more moderate range, begin to carry loads that exceed their intended capacity. Over time, this strain can lead to discomfort, reduced mobility, and a gradual wearing of the structures that allow movement. Muscles must adapt to a larger frame, yet their ability to generate force does not always scale evenly with size. What appears imposing from a distance can involve a quiet imbalance where strength struggles to keep pace with expansion. Everyday actions require more effort, and the coordination between different parts of the body becomes more demanding. Circulation introduces another layer of complexity. The heart must push blood through a larger network of vessels, reaching greater distances with each beat. This increased demand can place stress on the cardiovascular system, influencing blood pressure and overall endurance. The body works continuously to maintain equilibrium, yet the effort required becomes greater as size increases. Internal organs, including the lungs and kidneys, also operate within this expanded framework. Their function remains essential, yet their capacity does not always increase in direct proportion to body size. This imbalance can affect how efficiently the body processes oxygen and filters waste, adding subtle challenges that accumulate over time. Vision can be affected as well, as growth influences the structures surrounding the eyes. Nerve pathways may experience pressure, leading to changes in sight that further shape daily experience. These effects are not always immediately visible, but they contribute to the broader picture of how the body responds to prolonged growth. Life expectancy in such cases is often reduced not due to a single cause, but through the combined effect of these strains. The body continues to function, adapting where it can, yet the demands placed upon it remain constant. Medical care can address many aspects of the condition, offering treatments that help regulate hormone levels and manage symptoms, yet the underlying challenges remain part of the experience. Through this lens, great height becomes something more complex than simple scale. It reflects a system pushed beyond its usual balance, where each increase brings new demands that ripple through the entire body. The image of extraordinary stature remains, yet it is accompanied by the quiet reality of adaptation and limitation. In understanding this, the idea of a human body growing without bound begins to soften. Biological systems are interconnected, and their limits are shaped by relationships that must remain in balance. When one part extends beyond its range, others must adjust, and not all adjustments can be sustained indefinitely. There is a quiet law that shapes every living body, one that does not announce itself yet governs how size can change. When a form grows larger, its volume increases more quickly than the structures that support it. This relationship, often described through the square-cube principle, reveals that scale is not a simple matter of becoming bigger. It is a balance that must be maintained across many systems at once. As height increases, bones must carry more weight, yet their strength depends on their cross-sectional area rather than their length. A longer bone does not automatically become strong enough to support the mass it now holds. The result is a gradual shift where structure begins to lag behind demand, placing greater stress on the framework that holds the body upright. Muscles face a similar challenge. Their ability to generate force depends on their thickness, not their length. As the body extends, muscles must move larger limbs across greater distances, yet their capacity to do so does not expand at the same rate. Movements that once required little effort begin to demand more energy, and stability becomes harder to maintain. Balance introduces another layer of complexity. A taller body raises its center of gravity, making it more sensitive to small shifts in position. The systems that keep the body steady must work harder to compensate, adjusting continuously to maintain equilibrium. Even slight disturbances can require greater correction, increasing the effort needed for simple actions. Circulation becomes more demanding as well. The heart must move blood through a larger vertical distance, pushing against gravity to reach the upper regions of the body. This requires increased pressure, placing additional strain on the cardiovascular system. Over time, this effort can influence how efficiently blood is distributed, affecting both endurance and overall stability. Breathing follows a similar pattern. The lungs must supply oxygen to a greater volume of tissue, yet their capacity does not always expand in direct proportion to body size. This can limit how effectively oxygen is delivered during activity, shaping how the body responds to exertion and recovery. Within the skeleton, joints become points of concentrated stress. They are designed to handle specific ranges of force and motion, yet as size increases, these forces grow. The surfaces that allow smooth movement begin to experience greater wear, and the alignment that once supported efficient motion becomes more difficult to maintain. These changes do not occur in isolation. Each system interacts with the others, creating a network of dependencies that must remain in balance. When one part of the body is pushed beyond its optimal range, the effects ripple outward, influencing multiple aspects of function at once. This interconnectedness reveals a practical boundary, not as a fixed number, but as a range within which the body can operate effectively. Beyond this range, the demands placed on structure and function begin to outweigh the benefits of increased size. The body can still grow, but the cost of that growth becomes more pronounced. Seen in this way, human size becomes a question of engineering as much as biology. It is shaped by forces, materials, and constraints that determine what can be sustained over time. The image of limitless growth gives way to a more intricate reality where every increase must be supported by systems that are themselves bound by physical laws. Within this quiet framework, the human form reveals both its potential and its limits, existing within a narrow space where balance can be maintained. Distance can change the meaning of a body. Seen across a valley, along the edge of a settlement, or approaching from unfamiliar land, a person does not appear only as they are. They are shaped by contrast, by expectation, and by the quiet comparisons that form without effort in the mind. In earlier human communities, average height varied more than it does today. Diet, climate, disease, and daily labor all influenced how bodies developed. In one region, limited food and repeated illness could result in shorter stature across generations. In another, access to richer nutrition and different living conditions could support taller, broader builds. These differences were not extreme in absolute terms, yet when placed side by side, they could feel striking. When two groups encountered one another, the contrast became immediate. A person who stood only a head taller than those around them could appear imposing, especially when combined with unfamiliar features, clothing, or ways of moving. Strength, posture, and presence added to the impression, creating a sense of scale that extended beyond simple measurement. Memory does not always preserve exact proportions. It holds on to what feels significant, shaping detail around emotional weight. A figure remembered as large in a moment of tension or uncertainty may grow further in recollection, not through deliberate change, but through the natural process of emphasis. What stood out becomes the center of the memory, and other details align around it. Over time, these impressions can settle into shared narratives. A group known for its height or strength may be described in ways that reflect both observation and interpretation. The language used to describe them may shift, gradually amplifying the qualities that first drew attention. A tall individual becomes part of a larger pattern, and that pattern becomes part of a story. Cultural boundaries also influence how size is perceived. Differences in language, behavior, and appearance can make another group seem more distant, and physical traits become symbols of that distance. Height, in this context, is not only a measurement, it becomes part of how one group understands another, shaped by both familiarity and separation. Archaeological findings support the idea that height varied across populations. Skeletal remains from different regions show differences in average stature, reflecting the conditions under which people lived. These variations are well within the range of normal human biology, yet their impact and lived experience could be profound when groups met. In moments of conflict or competition, perception can shift further. A strong opponent may be remembered as larger than they were, their presence expanded in the telling. This is not a conscious distortion, but a reflection of how the mind processes intensity and significance. The body becomes a symbol of the encounter, carrying meaning beyond its physical dimensions. Through generations, these layered impressions can evolve into traditions that describe earlier people as larger, stronger, or more formidable than those in the present. The original contrast remains at the core, even as the details change. What began as a difference within human variation becomes something that feels closer to a different kind of being. Within this quiet transformation, the idea of giants can take shape without requiring bodies beyond biological limits. It grows from comparison, from memory, and from the way human perception responds to difference. The result is a story that carries both truth and interpretation, shaped by the meeting of people whose forms, though similar, felt far apart. There was a time when the human world was not singular. Across valleys, forests, and cold open plains, different kinds of people moved through the same landscapes, leaving traces that would only much later be understood as belonging to separate branches of the human story. Among them were the Neanderthals, whose presence stretched across thousands of years alongside our own species. Their bodies carried a distinct form, shaped by long adaptation to colder climates. Their bones were thick, their limbs strong, their chests broad. The structure of their faces differed in subtle but noticeable ways, with heavy brows and wide noses that reflected the environments they endured. Standing beside a modern human, the difference would not suggest something entirely alien, but something familiar that had taken a different path. Strength was part of their daily reality. Their muscle attachments indicate a life of physical demand, where survival required sustained effort and resilience. Their movements would have been grounded, deliberate, and efficient, shaped by the need to navigate landscapes that offered little ease. In close proximity, their presence would have felt substantial, not only in size, but in the quiet force carried within their build. For long periods of time, these two human forms shared the same regions. They encountered the same animals, faced the same shifting climates, and adapted to the same changing conditions. Their lives overlapped in ways that suggest not only awareness of one another, but moments of interaction that left traces in both archaeology and genetics. To encounter another human species would have introduced a different kind of recognition. The similarities would be immediate, expressed in posture, movement, and the use of tools. At the same time, the differences would be equally clear, creating a space where familiarity and distinction existed together. This combination could shape perception in ways that are difficult to fully reconstruct, yet its impact would have been lasting. The mind tends to organize experience through patterns, placing what is known within existing frameworks. When faced with something that is close to familiar, yet clearly different, those frameworks begin to stretch. A being that moves like a human, builds like a human, and lives within similar structures of life, yet appears stronger, broader, and shaped by a different history, occupies a space that does not fit easily into simple categories. Over generations, such encounters could settle into memory in ways that emphasize certain qualities. Strength might be remembered more than subtlety, presence more than detail. The distinctions between groups could become more pronounced in retelling, shaped by distance and the gradual transformation of memory into narrative. The reality that more than one kind of human existed at the same time carries its own quiet weight. It suggests a world that was richer and more complex than the one we know now, where identity was not singular and the boundaries between groups were defined by both connection and difference. This understanding does not rely on speculation. It is supported by fossil evidence, by shared genetic markers, and by the careful reconstruction of ancient lives through the remains they left behind. The coexistence of these groups is not a distant idea, but a documented part of human history. Within this context, the image of a powerful, human-like figure gains a new dimension. It does not require invention. It emerges from a time when the human family included more than one form, each carrying its own strengths, its own adaptations, and its own presence within the world they shared. High in the mountains of southern Siberia, within a cave shaped by time and cold air, a small fragment of bone was uncovered. It did not carry the size or form that might draw immediate attention. There was no complete skeleton, no clear outline of a body. What remained was modest, almost quiet in its presence, offering little at first glance beyond its age. From that fragment, a different kind of discovery began to unfold. Instead of relying on visible structure alone, researchers turned to the patterns preserved within the bone itself. Ancient DNA, held in microscopic traces, revealed something unexpected. The genetic sequence did not match known human populations, nor did it align fully with Neanderthals. It pointed instead to a distinct group, one that had lived and disappeared with little physical trace left behind. This group is now known as the Denisovans. Their presence is confirmed not through abundant remains, but through genetic signatures carried forward in modern populations. In parts of Asia and Oceania, small portions of Denisovan DNA persist, woven into the genetic fabric of people living today. These traces act as echoes, suggesting contact between groups that once shared the same world. The physical form of Denisovans remains largely unknown. A few fragments, a finger bone, parts of a jaw, isolated teeth, offer only limited clues. The scale of their bodies, the details of their faces, the way they moved through their environments, all remain uncertain. Reconstruction becomes an act of careful inference, guided more by comparison and probability than by direct observation. In this absence, the past takes on a different kind of presence. It is not defined by what can be clearly seen, but by what can be carefully traced through indirect evidence. Genetic analysis becomes a window, revealing relationships that physical remains alone cannot fully show. Through this method, entire populations emerge from fragments too small to suggest their existence on their own. The environments Denisovans inhabited were varied, extending across regions that required adaptation to different climates and altitudes. Evidence suggests that they possessed genetic traits suited to high elevation, allowing them to survive in places where oxygen is scarce. These adaptations remain visible today in certain populations, a continuation of traits shaped long before recorded history. Encounters between Denisovans and other human groups are suggested through these shared genetic patterns. At some point, these populations met, interacted, and left traces of one another that persist across generations. The details of these encounters are not preserved in clear narratives, yet their outcomes remain written within the biology of those who followed. This understanding introduces a sense of incompleteness that is not a limitation, but a feature of how the past is known. Much of human prehistory exists in fragments scattered across time, requiring careful assembly from pieces that rarely form a complete picture. Each new discovery adds clarity, yet also reveals how much remains beyond reach. Within this space, the idea of the human story expands. It becomes less defined by a single line of descent and more by a network of connections, overlaps, and divergences. The Denisovans occupy a place within this network, not fully visible, yet undeniably present through the evidence that endures. Their existence suggests a world where multiple human forms moved across the same landscapes, each carrying its own history, its own adaptations, and its own presence. What remains today is not a full account, but a set of traces that invite careful attention, offering glimpses into a past that is still unfolding through the work of discovery. Imagine a horizon that does not belong to one kind of traveler. Across plains, along rivers, and through wooded valleys, different human groups moved within the same world, each shaped by its own history, each carrying its own way of living. The land did not separate them completely. It held them together in overlapping ranges, where paths could cross and awareness could grow. For long stretches of time, the human story unfolded in parallel lines. Our own species spread outward, adapting to new environments, while other human relatives continued along their own trajectories. These groups were not distant in time, but present within the same eras, sharing seasons, resources, and shifting climates that shaped every life around them. Encounters between such groups would not have been constant, yet they did not need to be. Even rare meetings can leave lasting impressions. The sight of another human form, similar yet distinctly different, would carry a weight that extends beyond the moment. Recognition would come first, in posture and movement, followed by the realization that something about this presence did not fully align with what was familiar. Differences in build, in strength, in facial structure, or in the way tools were made and used could all contribute to this sense of separation. These variations were not extreme enough to erase similarity, yet they were clear enough to create distinction. In this space, between likeness and difference, perception begins to shift, guided by both observation and interpretation. Communication between groups may have been limited, shaped by language, behavior, and distance. Without shared systems of expression, meaning would rely more heavily on what could be seen and inferred. Actions, gestures, and physical presence would become the primary signals, carrying information that words could not easily convey. Within this context, memory begins to take form. Encounters, even brief ones, would be remembered and retold, shaped by the impressions they left behind. Over time, these recollections could become part of a broader understanding of the world, woven into narratives that describe not only what was seen, but how it was experienced. The presence of multiple human groups adds a layer of depth to the past that extends beyond physical remains. It suggests a lived world where diversity was part of everyday reality, where the idea of what it meant to be human was not confined to a single form. This complexity introduces a quiet richness, one that can be felt even through the fragments that remain. As generations passed, the direct memory of these encounters would fade, yet their influence could persist. Stories shaped by early experiences may carry forward, adapting to new contexts while retaining traces of their origin. Descriptions of beings who were stronger, broader, or different in subtle ways may reflect echoes of real interactions transformed through time. This possibility does not require exact preservation of detail. It allows for change, for the blending of observation and imagination, for the gradual shaping of memory into narrative. What remains is not a precise record, but a sense of something once present, something that stood alongside and then disappeared. Within this widening view, the question of giants takes on a different texture. It becomes less about isolated claims and more about the broader landscape of human experience. The past reveals itself not as a single path, but as a network of lives that overlapped, diverged, and left traces that continue to shape how that world is understood. There is a quiet tendency in human thought to look backward and see something larger than what stands in the present. The distance of time softens detail, allowing certain qualities to expand while others fade. What remains is not an exact image, but a shape formed by memory, imagination, and the feeling that something once stood at a greater scale. Across many cultures, earlier ages are described as periods of strength and intensity. The people of those times are remembered as more powerful, the creatures as more formidable, the world itself as less restrained. These descriptions do not arise from direct measurement. They emerge from the way time alters perception, stretching certain elements while compressing others. As generations pass, the immediate familiarity of daily life gives way to a more distant understanding of the past. Without direct experience, imagination fills the spaces between what is known and what has been forgotten. In this process, scale becomes one of the simplest ways to express difference. Larger bodies, larger structures, and larger events begin to represent a world that feels more significant than the present. This tendency is not random. It reflects a deeper pattern in how humans relate to time. The present is filled with detail, with limitations that are visible and constant. The past, by contrast, becomes a canvas where detail is reduced and meaning is amplified. Without the constraints of direct observation, it allows for expansion in ways that feel natural rather than exaggerated. Stories carry this pattern forward. When events are remembered and retold, emphasis often falls on what stands out. Strength becomes greater, achievements become more impressive, and challenges become more extreme. These changes do not always occur through conscious alteration. They arise through the natural process of storytelling, where significance is preserved even as specifics shift. Within this framework, the idea of giants fits easily. A larger body becomes a symbol of a larger world, a way of expressing that earlier times held something beyond what is now familiar. It is not necessary for such figures to exist in a literal sense for them to feel appropriate within these narratives. They align with the broader impression of a past that seems expanded in every dimension. The environment itself can contribute to this perception. Ancient ruins, weathered landscapes, and remnants of earlier activity suggest a scale of effort that may feel distant from the present. Without full understanding of how these were created, the mind interprets their size as evidence of greater capability. The people who built them become, in memory, larger as well. Language also plays a role in shaping this view. Words used to describe the past often carry a sense of magnitude, emphasizing strength, endurance, and intensity. Over time, these descriptions reinforce the idea that earlier ages were not only different, but greater in ways that are difficult to measure. This pattern reveals that the persistence of giant stories is not solely tied to physical evidence. It is connected to how humans experience the passage of time, how distance allows certain qualities to grow while others recede. The past becomes a place where scale can expand without resistance, where the limits of the present do not apply in the same way. In this quiet expansion, the image of giants remains not as a fixed claim, but as part of a broader way of understanding history. It reflects the human tendency to see what has come before as larger, deeper, and more powerful, shaped by the space that time creates between experience and memory. In moments of danger, perception narrows and sharpens at the same time. The body responds before thought can fully form, drawing attention to what feels most immediate, most threatening. Details that do not serve survival fall away, while certain features expand in importance, taking on a weight that lingers long after the moment has passed. When a person is seen as a threat, size becomes one of the qualities most easily amplified. A figure advancing with force, carrying unfamiliar tools, or moving with intent can appear larger than they are, not through illusion alone, but through the way attention is focused. The mind gathers what matters most and holds on to it, shaping a memory that emphasizes presence over precision. This process continues after the event ends. Memory is not a fixed record, but something that shifts as it is recalled and shared. In retelling, the elements that carried the greatest intensity are often the ones that remain. Strength, speed, and scale become central, while smaller details fade. The figure remembered is not only what was seen, but what was felt during the encounter. Across repeated tellings, these impressions can deepen. A person who was already perceived as formidable may grow in stature within the narrative, not through deliberate exaggeration, but through the natural reinforcement of what stood out. Each retelling strengthens the image, aligning it more closely with the emotional weight it carried. In situations of conflict, this effect can become more pronounced. An opponent who inspires fear is often remembered as overwhelming, their presence filling more space in memory than in reality. This does not require conscious alteration. It emerges from the way the mind processes threat, preserving what felt significant in a form that remains vivid. Unfamiliarity adds another layer to this transformation. When encountering someone whose appearance, behavior, or language differs from what is known, the mind has fewer reference points to anchor its understanding. This can create a sense of distance, where the individual is not only different, but difficult to place within existing categories. In this space, perception can shift, allowing the unfamiliar to take on qualities that feel larger or more intense. Over time, these altered perceptions can settle into shared narratives. Stories shaped by moments of tension or uncertainty carry forward the impressions formed in those conditions. A figure remembered as powerful may become a central presence within these accounts, their size and strength reflecting the impact they had rather than the measurements they held. Within oral traditions, this process unfolds gradually. Each generation receives the story and passes it on, shaped by its own understanding and context. The core remains, yet the details adapt, influenced by the emotions attached to the original experience. Size, as a symbol of power, becomes a natural element to expand, aligning the figure with the meaning it carries. This pattern reveals how memory and perception interact, creating forms that extend beyond immediate observation. The body seen in a moment of fear becomes something larger in recollection, shaped by the intensity of that moment. The transformation is not a break from reality, but an extension of it, guided by the ways in which the mind preserves what matters most. In this quiet reshaping, the idea of giants can emerge not from physical scale alone, but from the enduring imprint of encounters that left a lasting mark on those who experienced them. Words carried by voice do not travel as fixed shapes. They move through time in a softer form, shaped by breath, memory, and the quiet adjustments that occur each time a story is told. Within this movement, certain elements remain steady, while others shift almost without notice, guided by what feels most important to preserve. Oral tradition does not aim for exact repetition, it holds on to meaning, especially the emotional weight of an event or a person. The tone of a moment, the sense of strength, danger, or significance remains at the center. Around that core, details can change, adapting to new listeners, new contexts, and the passage of generations. When a story describes a leader known for presence and authority, that presence may grow in retelling. The memory of standing before someone who commanded attention becomes more defined, and over time, that definition can take on a larger form. Height becomes a natural way to express this, allowing the listener to feel the same impression that the original experience carried. A similar shift can occur with figures remembered for strength. Actions that required effort and skill may be retold with an emphasis on power, and that power can become embodied in the size of the person described. The change is not a distortion in the usual sense. It is a translation, moving from the reality of an action into a form that communicates its impact more clearly within the structure of the story. Difficult experiences can follow the same path. Events marked by danger or loss often carry a lasting emotional imprint. When these are passed down, the details may blur, yet the intensity remains. To convey that intensity, the story may adopt elements that extend beyond ordinary scale, shaping the memory into something that feels as powerful as the original moment. This process allows stories to remain meaningful even as they change. The surface may shift, but the core continues to carry what mattered most. Listeners receive not only information, but an impression, a sense of the experience that shaped the story in the first place. In this way, oral tradition preserves more than facts. It preserves the feeling of those facts as they were lived. Across generations, small adjustments accumulate. A description becomes slightly more pronounced, a comparison becomes more vivid, and an image becomes more defined. These changes do not occur all at once. They unfold gradually, each telling adding a subtle layer that aligns the story with the emotional truth it carries. Within this gradual shaping, figures can take on forms that feel larger than life. A tall individual becomes towering, a strong presence becomes immense, and a memorable encounter becomes something that approaches the extraordinary. These transformations do not erase the original reality. They extend it, allowing the story to communicate across time with clarity and force. The result is a narrative that holds both continuity and change. It remains connected to its origin while adapting to the needs of those who carry it forward. The listener encounters a version that reflects both the past and the present, shaped by countless voices that have preserved its meaning. In this quiet evolution, truth does not disappear. It shifts into a form that can endure, carried through the rhythm of speech and memory, where meaning remains steady even as the details gently drift. Stone has a way of holding silence while still speaking. Across different landscapes, great blocks rest in arrangements that seem to resist simple explanation, their surfaces weathered yet enduring, their placement suggesting intention carried out with care. When these structures were first encountered by later communities, they did not appear as the result of gradual effort. They appeared complete, already shaped, already set into forms that felt beyond ordinary reach. Without direct knowledge of how such constructions were achieved, the mind turned toward possibilities that matched the scale of what was seen. The size of the stones, the precision of their placement, and the apparent effort required to move them all pointed toward a level of strength that seemed difficult to assign to familiar human bodies. In this absence of visible process, explanation followed the path of proportion. Large works suggested large makers. These structures were not isolated. From open plains to coastal regions, from high plateaus to forested areas, similar forms appeared across wide distances. Massive stones arranged into circles, walls, or rising platforms carried a shared sense of weight and permanence. Each location held its own variations, yet the underlying impression remained consistent, a scale of construction that seemed to stand apart from everyday experience. The passage of time deepened this impression. As generations moved further from the original builders, the methods used to shape and place these stones faded from memory. What remained was the finished result, detached from the sequence of actions that created it. Without that sequence, the structures became objects of interpretation, their origins shaped by the perspectives of those who encountered them later. Human perception often links effort to size. When an object appears large and difficult to move, the assumption follows that the force behind it must be equally large. In the case of megalithic structures, this reasoning becomes especially strong, as the stones themselves offer no immediate clues about the techniques that brought them into place. The gap between what is seen and what is understood invites explanation. Cultural narratives provided a framework for this interpretation. Stories that described beings of great strength and stature offered a way to bridge the gap between observation and understanding. These figures, already present within tradition, could be connected to the structures, giving them a sense of origin that aligned with their scale. The stones became not only physical objects, but markers of a time when such beings were believed to have existed. This connection did not require precise evidence. It relied on the alignment between the size of the structures and the qualities attributed to these figures. Once established, the association could persist, carried forward through retelling and reinforced by the continued presence of the monuments themselves. The stones remained visible, steady across time, supporting the narratives attached to them. At the same time, these interpretations left certain aspects unresolved. The structures stood as complete forms, yet the process of their creation remained hidden. This absence created a space where curiosity could continue to grow, where the question of how such works were achieved lingered alongside the explanations offered. Within this quiet tension, the idea of giant builders became a doorway rather than a final answer. It pointed toward the scale of the achievement while leaving room for deeper understanding. The stones, unchanged in their placement, held both the story that had been told about them and the possibility of another explanation, waiting to be uncovered through closer attention to the methods that shaped them. A stone does not move on its own, yet it does not need to be lifted in a single motion to change its place in the world. Movement can be slow, guided by small advantages repeated again and again until what seemed fixed begins to shift with quiet certainty. Across different regions, evidence reveals that large stones were shaped and transported through methods grounded in simple physical principles. A block resting on the ground can be placed onto a wooden sledge, its base designed to slide rather than lift. When pulled across a prepared surface, friction becomes the main resistance, and even that can be reduced. Wetting the ground, packing it smooth, or laying down materials beneath the sledge allows the weight to move with less effort than expected. Rollers offer another approach. Logs placed beneath a stone create a moving pathway where the weight is transferred from one support to the next. As the stone advances, the rollers behind are carried forward and placed again in front, forming a continuous track. This method does not eliminate effort. yet it distributes it, allowing a group of people to guide a heavy load across distance with controlled movement. Leverage provides a different kind of advantage. A long beam placed beneath the edge of a stone can multiply the force applied to it. With careful positioning, even a small group can lift or tilt a large object slightly, creating space to insert supports or adjust its orientation. Repeated in stages, this process allows gradual elevation or repositioning without the need for sudden strength. Ramps extend this idea into vertical movement. By building an incline of earth, stone, or packed material, a heavy block can be drawn upward rather than lifted directly. The slope transforms height into distance, making the ascent manageable through steady pulling. As the stone rises, the ramp grows with it, shaping a path that connects ground level to its final position. These methods rely not on extraordinary individuals, but on coordination and planning. Groups working together can apply force in unison, guided by rhythm and shared effort. Each person contributes a small portion, yet the combined effect becomes sufficient to move objects that no single individual could shift alone. The process is measured, deliberate, and often extended over long periods. Time itself becomes part of the method. Large constructions were not completed in moments, but through sustained work across days, seasons, and generations. The pace allows for adjustment, for learning, and for the gradual refinement of technique. What appears as a single achievement from a distance is often the result of countless, smaller actions aligned toward a common goal. Archaeological findings support these approaches. Tool marks on stone surfaces, traces of ramps, and wear patterns on materials all suggest methods consistent with these principles. Experiments conducted in the present have demonstrated that similar techniques can move large stones using materials and knowledge available to ancient builders. Within this understanding, the scale of these monuments takes on a different meaning. Their size remains impressive, yet it is no longer separated from human capability. Instead, it reflects what can be achieved through patience, cooperation, and an understanding of how force can be guided rather than resisted. The stones remain where they were placed, unchanged in their presence. What shifts is the perspective from which they are seen, revealing that the strength required to move them was not beyond human reach, but embedded in the way humans work together with the principles that shape the physical world. Careful work begins not with grand conclusions, but with quiet attention to detail. When human remains are uncovered, the process that follows is deliberate and measured, guided by methods that have been refined over time. Each bone is treated not as an isolated object, but as part of a system that can reveal information when observed with patience and precision. Among the most important elements in this process are the long bones of the body. The femur, the tibia, and the humerus carry a direct relationship to overall height. Their length reflects how the body was built, and through established formulas, these measurements can be translated into an estimate of stature. This translation does not rely on assumption. It is based on patterns observed across many known skeletons, where the proportions between bones and height have been carefully recorded. The surface of each bone also holds information. Joint areas, where bones meet and move against one another, reveal how the body carried weight and responded to stress. The size and shape of these surfaces can indicate how forces were distributed during life, offering clues about both build and activity. A larger joint surface may suggest a body that bore greater loads, while its condition can reflect the passage of time and use. Measurement alone does not stand apart from context. Archaeologists consider the population from which a skeleton comes, comparing it to others found in the same region and period. Average height varies across different groups, shaped by environment, diet, and genetic background. By placing an individual within this broader pattern, the estimate gains depth, moving from a single number to part of a larger picture. The position of the body within the ground adds another layer of understanding. Burial practices, orientation, and associated objects can indicate cultural identity, social role, or time period. These details help situate the individual within a specific moment in history, allowing their physical characteristics to be interpreted alongside the life they may have lived. Bones themselves are also examined for signs of growth and development. The state of growth plates, the fusion of certain structures, and the wear on surfaces all contribute to an understanding of age at death. Age influences height, as bodies reach their full stature only after certain stages of development. This information ensures that estimates are made with attention to where the individual was in their life cycle. Through these combined observations, a skeleton becomes more than a set of remains. It becomes a source of measurable information, grounded in relationships that can be tested and compared. Each step in the process is documented, allowing others to review the findings and confirm the results. This consistency forms the foundation of how knowledge is built within the field. What emerges from this method is a view of the past that is anchored in evidence. Human size is not inferred from impression or description alone. It is calculated through repeatable techniques that draw from both biology and statistics. The range of height within ancient populations can be mapped, showing variation that reflects real differences rather than imagined extremes. Within this careful framework, the idea of stature becomes something that can be examined with clarity. The bones provide measurements, the context provides meaning, and together they form a record that can be revisited and understood. The process is quiet and exacting, yet it carries the ability to reveal how people once stood within their world, not as figures shaped by story, but as individuals whose physical presence can still be measured across time. Numbers drawn from bone carry a different kind of clarity. When measurements are assembled across sites and time periods, a pattern begins to appear, one that reveals the upper limits of human height in the ancient world. These limits are not imagined. They are reconstructed from remains that have been studied, compared, and placed within their historical context. Among these findings are individuals whose stature stood well above those around them. In certain burial sites across Europe, skeletons have been identified with estimated heights reaching close to 7 feet. Their long bones extend beyond the typical range for their populations, marking them as uncommon within their communities. These individuals would have been noticeable in life, their presence shaped by a difference that set them apart. Other examples emerge from different regions, each contributing to a broader picture. In parts of ancient North America, skeletal remains suggest individuals approaching similar heights, again exceeding the average of their time. These cases are not numerous, yet they are consistent enough to show that such stature did occur, arising within normal human variation rather than outside it. The process of estimation remains careful. Measurements of the femur and other long bones are translated through established relationships, producing a range rather than a single fixed number. This range reflects the natural variation in body proportions, ensuring that conclusions remain grounded in what can be supported by the evidence. What becomes clear through these findings is that ancient human height did not reach the extremes often described in legend. There is no record, within verified skeletal remains, of individuals standing at heights far beyond the upper limits observed in modern cases. The tallest ancient individuals fall within a range that, while impressive, remains biologically consistent with what is known about human growth. This does not diminish their presence. Within their own environments, where average height was often lower than it is today, such individuals would have appeared even more striking. A difference of several inches or more can become significant when placed within a population where most people stood well below that range. The effect is amplified by context, shaping how such figures would have been seen and remembered. The distribution of these tall individuals also offers insight. They do not form a separate group or lineage. Instead, they appear as part of the natural variation within their populations, emerging in different places and times without forming a continuous pattern. This suggests that their height was not the result of a distinct population of giants, but of individual differences shaped by genetics and environment. Across the broader data set, average heights in ancient populations often fall below modern averages, influenced by factors such as nutrition and health. Within this range, the tallest individuals stand out more sharply, their stature contrasting with those around them. This contrast contributes to the impression they leave, both in life and in the record that follows. Seen together, these measurements provide a clear view of what the human body achieved in the past. They show that height could reach levels that draw attention and invite memory, yet they remain within the boundaries set by biology. The figures that emerge are not part of a hidden race, but individuals whose bodies expressed the upper end of human variation. In this quiet reveal, the evidence settles into place. The tallest ancient skeletons offer a glimpse of what was possible, grounded in measurement and context, allowing the idea of great height to remain, while shaping it into a form that can be understood with clarity. Height is not written in bone alone. It is shaped gradually, beginning in childhood, guided by the conditions that surround a growing body. Food, health, and environment work together in ways that are often quiet, yet their influence becomes visible when patterns are traced across time. In periods where nutrition was limited, growth could be slowed or interrupted. The body, faced with scarcity, directs energy toward essential functions rather than extension. Bones lengthen less, development pauses or proceeds unevenly, and the final stature reflects the constraints experienced during early life. This effect is not uniform, yet across entire communities, it can shift the average height downward in a way that becomes noticeable in the archaeological record. Disease adds another layer to this process. Repeated infections, especially during childhood, place additional demands on the body. Energy that might otherwise support growth is redirected toward recovery. Over time, this repeated diversion can influence how fully the body develops, leaving traces that are visible in skeletal remains long after the individual life has ended. Environmental pressures also shape these outcomes. Climate, workload, and access to resources all contribute to how a population grows. In regions where food sources were less reliable or where daily survival required constant effort, the body adapted within the limits available to it. Height, in this context, becomes one expression of broader conditions, reflecting the balance between what the body needed and what it received. Within such settings, variation still exists. Even in populations where average height is reduced, some individuals grow taller than those around them. These differences can arise from a combination of factors, including more stable access to food, fewer illnesses during development, or inherited traits that favor greater stature. When placed within a generally shorter population, these individuals stand out more sharply. The contrast becomes part of perception. A person who is only moderately taller in absolute terms may appear significantly larger when compared to those around them. This effect is shaped by context, where relative difference carries more weight than exact measurement. The impression formed in such moments can linger, influencing how individuals are remembered within their communities. Across generations, these impressions can contribute to broader narratives. When a population experiences periods of hardship that limit growth, the appearance of a taller individual may seem especially striking. The rarity of such stature enhances its impact, making it more likely to be noted, described, and carried forward in memory. As conditions change, so do these patterns. Improvements in nutrition, health, and stability allow populations to reach greater average heights. This shift has been observed in more recent centuries, where increased access to food and medical care has supported fuller development. The change does not occur instantly, yet over time, it alters the range within which height is experienced. Seen across long stretches of history, human stature reveals a dynamic pattern shaped by forces that extend beyond genetics alone. The body responds to its environment, adjusting within the limits it is given. These adjustments leave a record that can be read through careful study, offering insight into the lived conditions of the past. Within this framework, the appearance of unusual height takes on a different meaning. It is not an anomaly detached from its surroundings, but part of a broader variation that becomes more visible under certain conditions. The sense of something larger than expected can emerge from ordinary biological processes shaped by contrast and context rather than by forms beyond human possibility. Inside every cell, a long sequence of information guides how the body forms, grows, and responds to the world. This sequence, carried in DNA, does not act through a single instruction when it comes to height. Instead, it unfolds through the combined influence of many genes, each contributing a small part to the final outcome. These genetic contributions work together in a layered way. Some influence how bones lengthen, others affect hormone regulation, while still others shape how the body responds to nutrition and environment. No single gene determines stature on its own. Height emerges from the interaction of many factors, each adding a subtle adjustment that becomes visible only when combined with the rest. When scientists examine the genetic patterns of modern populations, they find a wide distribution of traits related to height. These patterns are shared across human groups, with variation appearing as differences in frequency rather than as entirely separate sets of genes. This continuity suggests that the potential for tall stature exists within the broader human population, expressed in different ways depending on the combination of inherited traits. Ancient DNA extends this understanding into the past. By extracting genetic material from skeletal remains, researchers can compare ancient populations to those living today. These comparisons reveal connections that stretch across time, showing how traits have been passed down, modified, and redistributed through generations. The signals associated with height appear within this continuity, shaped by the same underlying mechanisms. What does not appear in this record is evidence for a distinct group defined by extreme size beyond known human limits. There is no genetic signature that points to a population of individuals whose stature would fall far outside the range supported by human biology. Instead, the variation observed fits within patterns that are consistent with the interaction of multiple genes and environmental influences. Genetics also reveals how populations have mixed over time. Movement, migration, and interaction have blended traits across regions, creating a network of shared ancestry. Height-related genes move within this network, contributing to the diversity seen today. This movement further supports the idea that variation in stature arises within a connected human story rather than from isolated groups of extraordinary size. The influence of genes is not fixed in isolation. Their expression depends on the conditions in which a person grows. Nutrition, health, and environment interact with genetic potential, shaping how fully it is realized. This interplay ensures that height remains a dynamic trait, responsive to both inherited information and lived experience. Modern genetic studies continue to refine this picture. By analyzing large data sets, researchers identify patterns that link specific genetic variations to differences in height. These findings do not point to a single cause, but to a complex system where many small influences combine to produce a range of outcomes. The result is a spectrum of human stature that reflects both shared biology and individual variation. Within this framework, the idea of human size becomes clearer. It is not the product of a hidden lineage with radically different proportions, but the result of countless small contributions working together. Each person carries a unique combination, shaped by ancestry and environment, expressed through the gradual process of growth. As this understanding settles into place, the mystery begins to narrow. The question of giants moves closer to the boundaries defined by biology, where evidence from DNA aligns with what is seen in bone and recorded in history. The possibilities become more focused, guided by patterns that can be traced and tested, bringing the shape of the answer into clearer view. Clarity begins quietly, not by removing wonder, but by placing each idea where it belongs. As the pieces settle, distinctions that once felt blurred start to separate into forms that can be seen more clearly, each grounded in its own kind of reality. A figure from legend carries a different weight than a body shaped by biology. In stories, scale is often symbolic, an expression of power, distance, or memory shaped over time. These figures are not constrained by the limits that govern living systems. They exist in a space where meaning can stretch beyond measurement, where size reflects significance rather than anatomy. In contrast, a person of exceptional height remains fully within the human framework. Their stature can be measured, recorded, and understood through known processes of growth. Even at the upper edges of what the body can sustain, the structure remains consistent with human design. Bones, muscles, and organs follow patterns that are recognizable, even when extended to unusual proportions. Beyond individual variation lies the presence of entire populations that may appear imposing without reaching extreme heights. Differences in build, density of bone, and muscular development can create a strong physical impression. When seen from outside, especially across cultural boundaries, such groups can seem larger than life. The effect is shaped not only by physical traits, but by perception, contrast, and the unfamiliar. Separate from both of these is the existence of other human species whose forms diverged through long evolutionary paths. These groups shared a common origin with modern humans, yet developed distinct features over time. Their bodies could appear more powerful or differently proportioned, shaped by the environments they inhabited. They were not simply taller versions of the same form, but variations within a broader human family. Each of these categories carries its own logic. Legendary figures arise from narrative and collective memory. Exceptionally tall individuals emerge from biological processes within a single species. Robust populations reflect environmental adaptation and cultural context. Other human species represent evolutionary divergence over vast spans of time. When these categories are placed side by side, the differences become more defined. A story of immense beings does not describe the same phenomenon as a documented case of unusual height. A strong and well-built group does not equate to a separate species. A separate species does not imply impossible scale. The distinctions are subtle at first, yet they grow clearer as each is understood within its own framework. This separation allows the idea of human size to be approached with greater precision. It becomes possible to recognize how different strands of evidence relate to different questions. Some belong to biology, others to anthropology, others to storytelling. Each contributes to the larger picture, but they do not all point to the same conclusion. As these threads are gently untangled, the shape of the narrative shifts. The presence of large figures in stories remains meaningful, yet it no longer carries the same kind of claim as measured bodies or genetic patterns. The strength of ancient populations becomes part of human diversity rather than evidence of something beyond it. The existence of other human species adds depth without requiring exaggeration. In this quiet sorting, the boundaries of possibility become more visible, not as limits imposed from outside, but as patterns revealed through careful observation. The world that emerges is still wide and complex, yet it is composed of elements that can be understood in relation to one another. What once seemed like a single question begins to separate into several, each with its own answer, each resting on its own kind of truth. Long after careful measurement and documented evidence became part of everyday understanding, the image of giants did not fade into silence. It shifted instead, finding new forms that moved through printed pages, whispered claims, and later through glowing screens. The setting changed, yet the presence remained, carried forward by something deeper than proof alone. In the modern age, stories of enormous human figures began to appear in newspapers that favored the unusual. Reports described discoveries that seemed to challenge accepted knowledge, often accompanied by dramatic language that drew attention more quickly than careful detail. These accounts traveled easily, shared between readers who encountered them as moments of curiosity rather than conclusions grounded in method. As publishing expanded, such ideas settled into books that explored the edges of accepted thought. Some authors presented them as overlooked truths, weaving fragments of information into narratives that suggested hidden histories. The appeal rested not in certainty, but in the sense that something important had been missed or concealed. The idea of giants adapted to this new environment, becoming part of a broader fascination with what might lie beyond official explanations. With the arrival of photography, another layer formed. Images carried a sense of authority, even when altered or presented without context. A carefully edited photograph could suggest scale that never existed, inviting viewers to accept what they saw as direct evidence. Over time, techniques for shaping images grew more refined, allowing impressions to be crafted with increasing subtlety. The result was not simply deception, but a blending of imagination and visual suggestion that felt persuasive at a glance. Digital media extended this process further. Information began to move at a speed that allowed little time for reflection. Stories could be shared widely within moments, reaching audiences far removed from their origin. In this environment, striking ideas held a natural advantage. The concept of giants, already familiar and visually powerful, fit easily into this flow, appearing in videos, articles, and discussions that echoed earlier patterns in new forms. Underlying this persistence are enduring human inclinations. There is a quiet pull toward things that feel larger than ordinary life, a curiosity that reaches beyond the visible and the known. Tales of immense beings offer a sense of scale that transforms the familiar world into something more expansive. They suggest that history may hold layers not yet fully revealed, inviting attention even in the absence of supporting evidence. Another element rests in the attraction to hidden knowledge. The suggestion that something significant has been overlooked or intentionally obscured carries a particular kind of weight. It creates a space where imagination can move freely, guided by fragments that appear to point toward a larger pattern. Within this space, the idea of giants finds a place to continue, shaped by the same impulses that sustained it in earlier times. Modern storytelling, in all its forms, becomes a continuation of this process. The tools have changed, yet the underlying movement remains similar. Information blends with interpretation, and interpretation blends with desire, creating narratives that feel compelling even when they stand apart from measured reality. As these threads move through the present, they form a living extension of older traditions. The stories are no longer tied to a single place or moment, but travel across networks that connect distant voices. In this way, the idea of giants persists, not as a fixed claim, but as a reflection of how people continue to explore the boundary between what is known and what is imagined. There is a quiet boundary where measured knowledge slows, not because it has failed, but because the past does not always leave a clear beginning behind. Science can follow bones through layers of earth, read genetic patterns carried across generations, and reconstruct the methods behind ancient structures. Yet the first spark of a story, the moment when an idea took shape in a human mind, often leaves no trace that can be recovered. Legends do not begin as written records. They emerge in voices, gestures, and shared impressions that pass from one person to another. The earliest versions dissolve into time, carried forward through retelling until their origin becomes impossible to isolate. Even when fragments of the past are preserved, they rarely point to a single starting point. Instead, they reveal a gradual formation, shaped by many small moments rather than one defining event. Across distant regions, similar ideas can arise without direct contact. Human perception works through patterns, and certain experiences repeat across environments. The discovery of unusual remains, the encounter with unfamiliar landscapes, or the presence of imposing figures can leave impressions that echo in different cultures. These impressions do not require a shared source to produce similar results. They emerge from the way human minds interpret what they see and carry those interpretations forward. Time deepens this process. As generations pass, stories adapt to new settings while retaining a core sense of meaning. Details shift, elements are added or lost, and the narrative adjusts to fit the needs of each era. The original context fades, replaced by layers that reflect changing perspectives. What remains is not a fixed account, but a living thread that continues to evolve. Science approaches this complexity with careful methods, tracing what can be tested and compared. It can identify the age of a fossil, the structure of a bone, or the genetic relationships between populations. These findings bring clarity to many aspects of the human story. They show where physical evidence supports or limits certain interpretations, narrowing the range of possibilities with increasing precision. Yet, even as this clarity grows, some aspects remain beyond direct reach. The exact path by which an idea traveled from observation to tradition cannot always be mapped. The emotional weight that gave a story its staying power cannot be measured in the same way as a bone or a sequence of DNA. These elements belong to the realm of human experience, where meaning is carried through memory rather than preserved in physical form. Different cultures may have shaped similar narratives through entirely separate processes. Each environment offers its own set of experiences, and each community interprets those experiences through its own lens. The resulting stories can resemble one another, not because they share a single origin, but because they arise from common patterns of thought and perception. Within this space, mystery remains, not as a gap to be filled with certainty, but as a reflection of the limits of what can be reconstructed. The absence of a single, traceable beginning does not diminish the value of what has been learned. Instead, it highlights the richness of a past that cannot be reduced to one explanation. As the evidence settles into place, a quieter understanding emerges. Science provides structure and boundaries, revealing what is supported and what is not. Beyond those boundaries, the origins of certain ideas remain open, shaped by countless voices that have long since faded. The story continues, carried not by a single source, but by the enduring patterns through which humans make sense of a world that has always felt larger than themselves. Some ideas settle into the mind with a quiet certainty that does not depend on proof. They feel aligned with something deeper, something that speaks not only to what is seen, but to how the world is experienced. The image of giants carries this kind of presence, resting in a space where evidence and emotion meet without fully replacing one another. There are moments when the world itself seems to exceed the scale of ordinary understanding. Ancient stone, worn smooth by time, carries a weight that is difficult to measure in simple terms. The remains of long vanished creatures lie embedded in layers that stretch beyond familiar history. Even the landscape, shaped over immense spans, suggests processes that move at a pace far removed from daily life. In these encounters, human perspective narrows, not through limitation, but through comparison. Within that narrowing, imagination adjusts. It seeks forms that can match the magnitude being perceived. Larger bodies, stronger figures, and beings of great size become natural extensions of this adjustment. They provide a way to translate vastness into something that can be held in thought. The idea does not arise from error alone, but from an attempt to bring scale into a form that feels recognizable. Memory plays a role in shaping this translation. When something leaves a strong impression, it is often carried forward with an intensity that alters its details while preserving its emotional core. The past becomes a place where events feel more concentrated, where distance lends weight to what is remembered. In that space, figures can grow in stature, not as a measured change, but as an expression of significance. There is also a quiet awareness of time that stretches beyond individual experience. The knowledge that the world existed long before any living memory introduces a sense of depth that cannot be fully grasped. Objects recovered from that depth carry an unfamiliar presence, as though they belong to a scale of existence that is no longer visible. In response, the mind fills the gap with forms that seem capable of inhabiting such a distant past. Stories become the medium through which these impressions are preserved. They gather fragments of observation, emotion, and interpretation into shapes that can be shared. Over time, the boundaries between what was seen and what was felt soften, allowing meaning to guide the structure of the narrative. Size, in this context, becomes a way of expressing importance, endurance, or power. Even as careful study refines what can be confirmed, these deeper patterns remain. The knowledge that human bodies follow certain limits does not erase the sense of scale encountered in the world. Instead, it places that sense within a different framework, one that separates physical possibility from symbolic expression while allowing both to exist side by side. The persistence of giant stories reflects this balance. They continue, not because the evidence supports them in a literal way, but because they resonate with experiences that are difficult to express through measurement alone. They give form to the feeling of standing before something older, larger and more enduring than the present moment. In this quiet intersection, the idea of giants remains, not as a conclusion drawn from data, but as a reflection of how human perception stretches to meet the vastness it encounters, shaping that encounter into something that can be remembered and shared. The shape of an answer does not arrive all at once. It gathers slowly, formed from pieces that once seemed separate, now resting together in a quieter arrangement. What first appeared as a single question begins to reveal a layered structure where different strands meet without dissolving into one. Fragments from deep time play their part. Remains preserved in stone carry the outlines of beings that no longer walk the earth, their size and form unfamiliar to those who later encountered them. These discoveries, emerging from the ground without explanation, offered a kind of evidence that invited interpretation long before there were tools to understand their origin. In that moment of encounter, the boundary between observation and imagination softened. Alongside these traces, the range of human bodies contributes its own dimension. Within the limits of biology, individuals have reached heights that stand far above the average of their time. Their presence would not have been common, yet it would have been visible, leaving impressions that lingered in memory. When seen through the lens of earlier centuries, such figures could easily take on a significance that extended beyond their physical form. Beyond individual variation, the existence of other human groups adds depth to the picture. These populations, shaped by different environments and histories, carried features that set them apart in subtle yet meaningful ways. Encounters between such groups would have been rare and striking, leaving behind impressions that blended familiarity with difference. Over time, those impressions could shift, carried forward through retelling until they took on a new character. Memory itself reshapes what it carries. Experiences are not preserved as exact records, but as impressions shaped by emotion and context. As stories pass from one generation to the next, details adjust while meaning remains. Size becomes one of the elements that can expand within this process, offering a way to express strength, distance, or importance in a form that is easily understood. Structures built from stone add another layer. Their scale, rising from landscapes long after their creators are gone, suggests a level of effort that can feel difficult to reconcile with ordinary means. In the absence of clear explanation, imagination fills the space, assigning these works to beings that match their apparent magnitude. The connection between construction and creator becomes part of a narrative that stretches across time. Perception, shaped by expectation and pattern, guides how all of these elements are seen. The mind seeks coherence, drawing connections between what is discovered and what is already believed. In doing so, it creates a framework where separate observations can merge into a single idea. That idea, once formed, gains strength through repetition, becoming part of a shared understanding. When these threads are viewed together, the outline of the legend begins to clarify. It is not the record of a single hidden population, but the convergence of many influences, each grounded in its own kind of reality. Physical evidence, human variation, ancient encounters, memory, and interpretation all contribute to a story that feels unified, even as its origins remain diverse. The answer that emerges does not remove the sense of wonder, it changes its shape. Instead of pointing toward beings that stood outside the limits of human biology, it reveals a process through which ordinary elements combined to create something that feels extraordinary. The legend becomes a reflection of how humans gather meaning from what they encounter, shaping those encounters into forms that endure. In this way, the mystery remains open, not as an unresolved question, but as a deeper understanding of how stories are formed from the meeting of evidence and imagination, each leaving its mark on what is remembered. A question that once stood at the beginning now rests in a quieter place, shaped by everything that has been seen along the way. It has not vanished, nor has it been answered in a single, simple line. Instead, it has unfolded, revealing a landscape of understanding that feels broader than the question itself. Humanity has always moved through a world that seems larger than its own scale. From the earliest moments of awareness, there has been an effort to interpret what lies beyond immediate experience. When the ground reveals something unexpected, or when the past leaves behind traces that resist easy explanation, the mind reaches outward, forming ideas that can hold that sense of vastness. The stories of giants belong to this movement. They do not stand as isolated inventions, but as part of a longer pattern through which people have tried to give shape to what feels immense. As knowledge has grown, the literal form of those stories has softened, yet their presence has not disappeared. They remain as reflections of how humans think, remember, and seek meaning in what they encounter. What emerges from careful study is not a smaller world, but a more intricate one. The record of life includes creatures whose size surpasses anything that walks today, preserved in forms that speak of distant eras. Within human history, individuals have reached heights that stretch the boundaries of what the body can sustain. There was also a time when different kinds of humans shared the same earth, each carrying its own way of being. The structures left behind by ancient builders add another layer to this understanding. Their scale, their precision, and their endurance suggest a level of achievement that continues to invite reflection. These works do not require beings beyond human capacity to exist. They stand instead as evidence of what can be accomplished through patience, cooperation, and knowledge shaped over generations. Seen together, these elements create a picture that is both grounded and expansive. The need for giants as literal figures fades, yet the sense of scale that inspired them remains. It shifts from imagined bodies to real processes, from symbolic forms to measurable patterns, without losing the feeling that the world extends far beyond the limits of a single lifetime. In this way, science does not erase the mystery, it reveals a deeper one. It shows that the past is not a simple narrative, but a layered history shaped by forces that continue to unfold. Each discovery adds detail while also opening new spaces for reflection, where understanding grows alongside curiosity. If this journey has settled gently into your thoughts, there is space to linger with it a little longer. Among the many threads that have appeared, some may feel closer than others. The remains of ancient life, the presence of other human kinds, the stories that once filled entire cultures, the works built from stone, or the ways memory transforms what it holds. Each offers its own path through the same landscape. You are welcome to share which of these paths stayed with you and where you are listening from in this quiet moment. The distance between voices often carries its own sense of scale, connecting places that would otherwise remain apart. If you would like to continue exploring these calm passages through science and history, a simple gesture of support allows the journey to keep unfolding. For now, the story settles where it began, within a world that continues to feel vast, shaped by time, perception, and the enduring effort to understand what lies beyond the familiar.